The air is not merely cold, it is a weight. It is a heavy blue-gray blanket that has settled over the Brooks Range, pressing down upon the gravel of the Dalton Highway with a finality that feels ancient. Here, the world is composed of only a few colors. There is the deep, bruised indigo of the sky before the moon rises. There is the charcoal gray of the frozen road, carved through the permafrost. There is the dull, matte silver of the pipe itself, a long, horizontal spine that stretches toward the Arctic Circle, vanishing into a haze of ice crystals. The light is dim, like a drawing made with soft pastels on a sheet of dark, textured paper. Every edge is blurred by the frost. Every shadow is a smudge of soot-colored graphite. In this stillness, the only movement is the slow, rhythmic exhale of a man whose breath turns instantly into a cloud of white needles, drifting for a moment before falling as dust onto the collar of his heavy wool coat. He walks. His boots, lined with thick felt and reinforced with heavy rubber, make a sound that is less of a crunch and more of a dry, hollow snap against the frozen earth. It is a repetitive sound. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The cadence is hypnotic, a metronome for the end of the world. The Dalton Highway, known to those who built it as the Hall Road, is a ribbon of silence. It does not feel like a road tonight. It feels like a scar on the skin of a sleeping giant. The man is a pipeline walker, a shadow moving alongside the silver vein of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. His duty is not to fix, but to witness. He looks for the subtle signs of the Earth's rejection, the heaving of the permafrost, the slight tilt of a vertical support member, the dark stain of oil against the pristine, crystalline snow. But tonight, there is only the gray. The pipeline vibrates. If he were to press his gloved hand against the insulation, he would feel the low-frequency hum of millions of barrels of crude oil, moving at a steady, sluggish pace from the north to the south. It is a warm pulse in a cold body. The oil is heated, kept thin enough to flow, and that heat creates a strange microclimate around the steel. Occasionally, a wisp of vapor rises from the pipe's casing, a ghost of warmth that is immediately strangled by the sub-zero air. The sound of the flow is a dull roar, so low it is felt in the marrow of the bones rather than heard in the ears. It is a constant, heavy drone that never changes pitch. It is the sound of the Earth's blood being moved by machines, a mechanical heartbeat that fills the vast, empty spaces between the mountains. Around him, the landscape is a study in chiaroscuro. The soft pastel strokes of the mountains are layered in shades of slate and navy. There are no sharp lines here. The wind has rounded the edges of the snowdrifts, turning them into smooth, frozen waves that look like they were carved from soapstone. The man carries a lantern, a small, flickering beacon of warm amber light that cuts a narrow path through the gloom. The lantern light does not reach far. It illuminates the texture of the gravel at his feet, the rough, jagged edges of the crushed stone, each one coated in a fine glaze of rime. It catches the weave of his heavy trousers, the way the wool fibers have frozen into a stiff, protective armor. The light is a small, fragile thing, a pale yellow smudge against the infinite blue of the Alaskan night. He focuses on the vertical support members, the VMS. They rise from the ground like the ribs of a prehistoric beast, holding the pipe aloft. Each one is a feat of engineering, designed to keep the heat of the oil from melting the frozen ground below. He looks at the heat pipes at the top of each support, the ammonia-filled tubes that draw the warmth upward and away. They are silent sentinels. In the dim light, they look like charcoal sketches, their forms defined by the darkness behind them rather than the light upon them. He checks the tilt. He checks the seals. He does this every mile, every hour, every day. It is a boring task. It is a necessary task. The boredom is a shield against the cold. If he were to think of the vastness, he might be overwhelmed. So he thinks only of the next support, the next mile marker, the next breath. The wind begins to pick up, but it does not howl. It is a dry, thin whistle, the sound of air passing through a needle's eye. It carries the scent of nothing, no trees, no water, no life. It is the scent of pure, distilled cold. It brushes against his face, the only part of him exposed to the elements, and he feels the skin tighten and go numb. He does not rub it. He simply adjusts the scarf, a heavy, hand-knitted length of dark yarn that smells of wood smoke and old grease. The texture of the scarf is rough against his chin, a reminder of a world that is not made of ice. He counts his steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 10, he stops. He listens. He listens for the sound of metal contracting, the sharp, rifle-shot crack of steel adjusting to the dropping temperature. It is a sound that can travel for miles in the thin air, a lonely, industrial cry in the wilderness. The sky above is a deep, velvety black, but it is not empty. Stars are visible, but they do not twinkle. They are hard, fixed points of light, like salt scattered on a dark table. They offer no warmth. They are millions of miles away, indifferent to the man walking along the gravel road. The Milky Way is a faint, dusty smear of white pastel across the zenith, a ghost of a galaxy. The man does not look up for long. To look up is to realize his own insignificance. To look up is to feel the weight of the vacuum. He keeps his eyes on the pipe. The pipe is real. The pipe is heavy. The pipe is a line that leads home eventually. The shadows cast by the pipeline are long and distorted. They stretch across the road like the bars of a cage. As he moves, the shadows shift and flow, crawling over the snowdrifts. They are deep, saturated blacks that seem to swallow the light of his lantern. He watches the way the light catches the frost on the pipe's surface. Each ice crystal is a tiny prism, reflecting a speck of amber light before fading back into the gray. It is a slow, glittering display, a silent fireworks show of hoarfrost. The pipe is covered in it, a thick white fur of ice that softens its mechanical edges. It looks organic, like a giant white serpent sleeping in the snow. His hands inside their heavy deer-hide mittens are warm, but it is a stagnant, heavy warmth. The sweat of his palms has nowhere to go, and he can feel the dampness starting to cool. He knows he must keep moving. To stop is to let the cold in. The cold is patient. It waits for a lapse in movement, a gap in the insulation, a moment of stillness. It is always pressing against him, seeking a way to drain the heat from his core. He feels it in his toes, a dull ache that has become a familiar companion. He feels it in the bridge of his nose. He moves his jaw side to side to keep the muscles from locking. The sound of his own chewing, the dry grind of his teeth, is loud in his hooded ears. The history of this road is written in the debris along its edges. Occasionally, his lantern light catches a discarded piece of cable, a rusted bolt, or a scrap of insulation. These are the fossils of the construction era, the 1970s, when thousands of men swarmed over this landscape with heavy machinery and fire. Now, the men are gone and the silence has returned, more profound than before. The road was built in a fever of activity, a race against time and the elements, but now it exists in a state of permanent hibernation. The man feels like a ghost walking through a graveyard of ambition. The pipe is the only thing that remains active, the only thing that still has a purpose. Everything else has been reclaimed by the frost. He reaches a bend in the road where the pipeline leaves the shoulder and heads off into the tundra on its elevated supports. Here, the ground is more uneven and the shadows are deeper. He has to step off the gravel and onto the packed snow. The texture changes, the sound changes. The snap of the gravel is replaced by the muffled thud of snow. It is quieter here. The wind is blocked by a small ridge, and for a moment the world is absolutely still. He stops. He holds his breath. The silence is so heavy it feels like a physical pressure on his eardrums. It is a silence that has existed since the retreat of the glaciers, a silence that the pipeline only interrupts with its low, mechanical moan. He stands there for a long minute, a dark figure in a blue landscape, illuminated by a single, dying spark of amber. The drawing of this moment would be simple: a dark foreground, a smudge of orange at the center, and a series of receding gray arches disappearing into a charcoal mist. There would be no horizon, only a transition from the dark blue of the earth to the darker blue of the sky. The texture of the pastel would be visible, the grain of the paper providing the illusion of falling frost. It is a scene of profound isolation, yet it is not lonely. Loneliness requires the expectation of company. Here there is no such expectation. There is only the duty. There is only the walk. He adjusts his pack, the straps groan under the tension. Inside he carries a thermos of coffee, a radio that mostly emits static, and a few basic tools. The weight of the pack is a comfort. It anchors him to the earth, preventing the wind from blowing him away like a dried leaf. He thinks about the coffee, the bitterness, the steam, the way the cup would feel against his cracked lips. But it is too cold to stop and drink. To open the thermos would be to lose the heat too quickly. He saves the thought of the coffee for later, a mental reward for reaching the next pumping station, miles to the south. The pipeline spans a small, frozen creek. The ice on the creek is different from the snow. It is a deep, translucent turquoise, visible even in the dim light. It is cracked in places, showing the immense pressure of the freezing water beneath. The pipe crosses it with a long, elegant stride, its supports anchored deep into the permafrost on either side. The man follows the maintenance path, his boots finding the familiar footholds. He looks down at the ice. He imagines the water trapped beneath, moving slowly if at all. Everything here is trapped. The oil is trapped in the pipe. The water is trapped in the ice. The man is trapped in his suit of wool and leather. He continues. The monotony is the point. The repetition is the work. Each step is a victory over the environment, a small, quiet defiance of the cold. The Dalton Highway stretches out before him, a gray line on a blue map, leading into the heart of the winter. He is the pipeline walker, the silent observer of the silver vein, moving through a world of soft pastels and deep shadows, where time is measured not in hours, but in miles of steel. The hum of the pipe continues, a low, vibrating song that accompanies him through the dark, a mechanical lullaby for the frozen earth. The boots continue their heavy, rhythmic measurement of the earth. Each step is a deliberate negotiation with the permafrost, a slow calculation of friction and weight. The gravel of the Dalton Highway is not a single surface. It is a layered history of geological patience and human interference. Beneath the man's tread lie millions of tons of crushed rock, hauled here in a desperate summer decades ago to create a stable spine over the heaving, frozen silt. In the dim, amber glow of the lantern, the gravel looks like a collection of dark, rounded pebbles in a charcoal drawing, their edges softened by a fine dusting of crystalline rime. The rime ice is delicate, a feather-like growth of frozen moisture that clings to every upward-facing surface. It grows in the direction of the wind, creating tiny, horizontal forests of ice on the steel of the pipeline and the wool of his sleeves. To look closely at the rime is to see the slow, silent breath of the Arctic taking shape, a white lace that smothers the world in a cold embrace. The pipeline itself, a 48-inch diameter cylinder of high-tensile steel, remains his constant companion. It is coated in a thick layer of fiberglass insulation, which is encased in a galvanized steel jacket. This jacket is what he sees, a dull, reflective gray that catches the lantern light in a long, smudged streak. The jacket is held together by thousands of rivets, each one a small, metallic bump that casts a tiny, elongated shadow against the dark blue of the night. He passes a section where the insulation has slightly shifted, a gap no wider than a finger. He stops. The movement is slow, his joints protesting the lack of fluidity. He leans in, the warmth of his breath momentarily obscuring the metal. The gap is small, but in this environment, small things are the harbingers of ruin. He notes the location mentally, milepost 243.6. There is no urgency in his notation. The urgency died long ago, replaced by a steady, grinding sense of maintenance. The pipe will endure, and he will endure as long as the routine is observed. The history of this steel is a boring history, a history of metallurgy and logistics. In 1968, the oil was found at Prudhoe Bay, a vast, invisible sea of ancient carbon trapped beneath the ice. To move it, men had to conceive of a way to cross 3 mountain ranges, 800 rivers, and a landscape that wanted to swallow everything whole. The steel for the pipe was rolled in mills thousands of miles away in Japan, where the air was humid and the sun was bright. It was shipped across the Pacific, stacked in massive yards at Valdez and Fairbanks, and eventually hauled up this very road. Each segment of pipe is 40 feet long. Each weld was X-rayed for flaws. The man thinks of the millions of welds stretching out into the dark, hidden beneath the insulation. They are the invisible stitches holding the economy of a distant world together. He touches the cold metal jacket. It feels like the skin of a dormant machine, a vessel for a substance he will never see, only monitor. The vertical support members, the VSMs, are spaced exactly 60 feet apart in this section. They are the H-shaped frames that keep the pipe from touching the ground. If the pipe were to touch the ground, the heat of the oil, which can reach over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, would melt the permafrost. The ground would turn to a slurry of mud and water, and the pipe would sag, buckle, and eventually snap. To prevent this, the engineers designed the thermosiphons. These are the long, slender tubes that rise from the top of the VSMs like the antennae of a buried insect. Inside them, anhydrous ammonia cycles in a perpetual loop, boiling at the bottom and condensing at the top, drawing heat out of the soil and releasing it into the frozen air. The fins at the top of the tubes are designed to maximize surface area, catching what little wind there is. In the soft, dark pastel light of the moonless night, the fins look like the ribbing of a bat's wing, a series of parallel lines drawn in sharp, dark graphite. They are silent, working without moving parts, a mechanical miracle of thermodynamics that occurs in the background of his walk. The man's mind drifts to the construction of the road itself. Before it was the Dalton Highway, it was simply the TAPS Hall Road. In 5 short months in 1974, a path was carved from the Yukon River to the Arctic Ocean. It was a feat of raw, industrial will. Thousands of trucks, their engines roaring in a constant, deafening chorus, moved back and forth through the dust and mud. Now the roar is gone. The trucks are fewer, their headlights visible from miles away as they crest the distant passes of the Brooks Range. From this distance, they are merely drifting sparks, slow-moving embers in a fireplace that is slowly going out. The man does not wait for them. He is on a different schedule, a schedule dictated by the steady, internal hum of the pipe. He is a ghost on the shoulder of a ghost road. The sky begins to change, though not toward light. The deep indigo shifts toward a bruised purple, a heavy, saturated color that feels like it was applied with the broad side of a soft pastel stick. There are no clouds, only a haze of suspended ice crystals known as diamond dust. They catch the light of his lantern, creating a shimmering, ethereal halo around him. Each crystal is a perfect hexagon, a tiny, geometric masterpiece that exists for only a moment before settling into the snow. The air feels thicker now, more difficult to pull into his lungs. The cold has a way of shrinking the world, drawing the horizon inward until there is only the man, the pipe, and the small circle of yellow light. He feels the weight of the silence. It is not an empty silence. It is a dense, physical presence that rings in his ears like a distant bell. It is the sound of the Earth's absolute zero, a temperature where molecular motion slows to a crawl. He reaches a segment where the pipe crosses a stretch of muskeg. Here, the supports are driven deeper, 70 feet into the frozen muck to reach the stable bedrock. The ground here is treacherous in the summer, a sponge of moss and peat that can swallow a man to his waist. In the winter, it is a hard, unyielding desert of white and gray. He walks carefully, his eyes scanning the base of each support for frost heave, the way the ice can expand and push the steel pillars out of alignment. He looks for the heave marks, the small, telltale disruptions in the snow that indicate movement. There are none. Everything is frozen in a state of perfect, crystalline stasis. The drawing of this scene would require the finest points of the colored pencils, drawing the minute cracks in the snow crust, the way the shadows of the VSMs are cast in a deep, cold violet across the white expanse. His own body has become a landscape of textures. The wool of his balaclava is wet with the frozen moisture of his breath, the fibers stiffening into a hard, abrasive mask. The leather of his mittens has lost its suppleness, becoming a rigid casing for his hands. He can feel the individual threads of his thermal layers pressing against his skin, a constant, dull reminder of the barrier between him and the void. He moves his fingers inside the mittens, a slow, rhythmic clenching. Open, close. Open, close. It is a small fire he keeps burning in his extremities. His heart rate is low, a steady thumping that he can hear in the silence of his hood. He is a closed system, a small pocket of warmth moving through a vast, heatless vacuum. The story of the pipeline is a story of insulation. It is a story of keeping the heat in and the cold out. The man is a part of that story. He is the last layer of insulation, the human eye that ensures the integrity of the barrier. He thinks about the oil inside, the dark, viscous fluid that was once sunlight and ferns and ancient life. It is moving at about 5 miles per hour, a slow, subterranean river flowing toward the tankers in the south. It is the lifeblood of a civilization he hasn't seen in weeks, a civilization that exists in a different climate, a different reality. To them, the oil is a number, a price, a gallon of fuel. To him, it is a vibration in the soles of his feet. It is a responsibility that requires him to walk through the blue-gray dark until his mind becomes as numb as his toes. He stops at a mile marker. It is a simple metal post with a numbered plate, partially obscured by a drift of wind-blown snow. He reaches down and brushes the snow away with a gloved hand. The sound is a soft, dry hiss like sand on silk. The number is 245. He has walked 2 miles since his last check. 2 miles of gravel, 2 miles of pipe, 2 miles of rhythmic, hollow snapping. In this environment, distance is not measured in miles, but in the depletion of his lantern's fuel and the gradual cooling of his own core. He looks back the way he came. His tracks are already being filled by the shifting diamond dust, the evidence of his passing being erased by the patient, indifferent hand of the wind. He is a smudge on a dark surface, a mark that will eventually be blended back into the background. The wind shifts slightly, coming from the north now off the Beaufort Sea. It brings a new texture to the air, a sharper, more aggressive cold that stings the small patch of skin around his eyes. He adjusts his goggles, the plastic frames feeling like ice against his temples. The world through the lenses is tinted a pale, sickly yellow, a color that makes the deep blues of the landscape look even colder. He sees the pipe stretching out before him, a series of identical arches, an endless corridor of steel. There is no end in sight. There is only the next VSM, the next support, the next breath. He resumes his walk. Snap, pause, pause. The monotone of the movement becomes a form of meditation. He is no longer a man walking a road. He is a part of the road itself, a slow-moving element in a vast, frozen machine. The hum of the oil continues, a heavy, vibrating drone that fills the world, a mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the Brooks Range. The drawing continues. More charcoal for the shadows under the pipe, more deep indigo for the sky, a few more strokes of white pastel for the rime ice on the rivets. The lantern light is a small, flickering dot of orange in a universe of cold, dark colors. It is a quiet image, a heavy image, an image of duty in a place where the sun has forgotten to rise. The lantern's flame is a small, captive spirit, dancing behind a pane of soot-streaked glass. It hums a low, rhythmic song, a faint hiss of burning fuel that is the only warmth in a world of blue-gray shadows. The man watches the flame through the corner of his goggles, a tiny orange needle flickering in the vast, charcoal-colored fabric of the night. He is entering a section of the pipeline where the design shifts. Here, the pipe does not run in a straight, unwavering line toward the horizon. Instead, it moves in a series of long, deliberate zigzags, a trapezoidal pattern that repeats every few hundred yards. In the dim light, these bends look like the heavy, geometric strokes of a dark pastel pencil, jagged lines carved into a background of velvet and slate. The purpose of these bends is a matter of boring, industrial necessity. Steel, even the thick, tempered steel of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, is a living thing in this climate. It expands in the heat of the flowing oil and contracts in the brutal grip of the Arctic winter. Without these zigzags, the pipe would tear itself apart, the sheer force of its own contraction snapping the welds like brittle twigs. He walks the perimeter of a bend. Each corner is a slow, wide arc, a testament to the physics of stress and strain. The pipe rests upon a massive shoe, a heavy steel cradle lined with a thick layer of Teflon. This shoe is designed to slide across the horizontal crossbeam of the vertical support member. As the man passes, he listens. If the temperature is dropping rapidly enough, he might hear the sound of the pipe moving, a sound that is not a scream but a deep, resonant groan like the shifting of a glacier. It is a sound of immense weight sliding over a frictionless surface, a metallic shudder that vibrates through the gravel beneath his boots. In the stillness, the sound is magnified, a heavy, tectonic noise that seems to come from the earth itself. He looks at the shoe in the yellow wash of his lantern. The Teflon is coated in a fine, white powder, the residue of decades of slow, microscopic movement. It looks like the dust from a chalkboard, a pale smudge against the dark, oily gray of the steel. This is the history of the TAPS design, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. It is a history of fighting the very nature of matter. In the early 1970s, engineers realized that a straight pipe would be a disaster. They calculated the thermal expansion of 800 miles of steel and found that the pipe could grow or shrink by as much as several hundred feet over its entire length. The trapezoidal zigzag was the solution, a way to allow the pipe to breathe within its supports. The man appreciates the logic of it. It is a slow, patient solution to a slow, patient problem. He runs his hand along the galvanized jacket of the pipe as he follows the bend. The texture is cold and rough, the metal feeling like frozen skin. There are thousands of these bends between Prudhoe Bay and Valdez, each one a calculated margin of safety, each one a silent witness to the predictable behavior of molecules in the cold. The landscape around the bend is a sea of shadows. The Brooks Range looms in the distance, though it is more of a feeling than a sight, a deeper, more solid darkness against the indigo sky. The peaks are drawn with soft, blunt strokes of navy blue and charcoal, their silhouettes blurred by the constant presence of the diamond dust. The wind, which has been a steady, thin whistle, begins to drop, leaving behind a silence so absolute it feels like a heavy coat. In this silence, the man can hear the internal mechanisms of his own body. He can hear the soft, wet slide of his eyelids when he blinks. He can hear the rasp of his thermal base layer against his skin. He can hear the slow, rhythmic thump of his heart, a dull drumbeat in the center of his chest. He feels the weight of his parka, a heavy, multi-layered garment filled with the down of birds that once flew in warmer skies. The parka is a fortress. It is his home, his shelter, and his prison. The gravel pad beneath him is wider here, a material site where the road and the pipeline share a massive foundation of crushed rock. The history of this gravel is a story of immense, boring labor. To build this pad, millions of cubic yards of rock had to be excavated from the riverbeds and hillsides of the interior. It was hauled by a fleet of yellow trucks that ran 24 hours a day, their headlights cutting through the summer dust. Now the gravel is a frozen monolith, a rock-hard floor that preserves the permafrost below. If the gravel were thinner, the weight of the road would press down, the friction of the trucks would generate heat, and the frozen earth would turn to a swamp. The engineers called it thermal integrity. To the man, it is simply the ground. It is the only thing he knows for certain. It is a surface of gray and black, a mosaic of jagged stones held together by a mortar of ice. He reaches a sectionalizing valve, a massive mechanical gate that stands like a fortress in the middle of the tundra. These valves are the sentinels of the line, designed to shut off the flow of oil in the event of a leak. The valve house is a small, corrugated metal shed, painted a dull, industrial green that looks almost black in the moonlight. It is covered in a thick, white crust of hoarfrost, the ice forming long, delicate needles that point toward the north. The man stops at the door. He doesn't go inside. His job is to check the exterior, to ensure the hydraulic lines aren't leaking, and that the snow hasn't drifted too high against the vents. He holds the lantern up to the pressure gauges visible through a small, reinforced window. The needles are steady, fixed points in a circle of white light. They indicate the pressure of the oil, the invisible force that moves the liquid south. The gauge faces are yellowed with age, the numbers written in a functional serif font that reminds him of old technical manuals. The history of these valves is a history of caution. There are over 100 of them along the route, each one a fail-safe against a catastrophe that has, so far, remained a ghost. They were installed with great effort, their heavy steel bodies lowered into place by massive cranes. Now they sit in the cold, their internal gears bathed in specialized, low-temperature lubricants that never freeze. The man imagines the oil inside the valve. A dark, warm river paused for a moment by a wall of steel. He feels a strange kinship with the valve. He, too, is a gatekeeper, He, too, exists in a state of constant, quiet readiness. The drawing of the valve house would be a study in texture, the corrugated metal represented by vertical lines of dark gray, the frost by jagged, bright white highlights, and the window a small, glowing square of amber. As he moves away from the valve house, the wind returns, but it is different now. It carries a low, mournful hum as it passes through the fins of the nearby thermosiphons. It is a hollow sound, like someone blowing across the top of a glass bottle. The sound is repetitive, a two-note song that stays at the same volume, the same pitch, the same tempo. It is the music of the pipeline. It is the sound of heat leaving the earth, a mechanical exhale. The man matches his stride to the hum. Snap, pause, snap, pause. His knees ache with a dull, persistent throb, a reminder that he has been walking for hours. The fluid in his joints feels thick, like the oil in the pipe, moving slowly and with great resistance. He does not stop. To stop is to allow the cold to settle, to let the layers of wool and down lose their loft. The sky remains a bruised purple, but a faint, ethereal green glow begins to shimmer near the northern horizon. It is the aurora borealis, but it is not the dancing, vibrant display seen in photographs. Tonight, it is a pale, ghostly curtain, a smudge of lime green pastel that has been blended into the dark blue background. It doesn't move so much as it breathes, expanding and contracting with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It offers no light to the ground. It is merely a reminder of the thinness of the atmosphere and the vast, cold radiation of space. The man looks at it for a moment, his eyes watering from the cold. The green light reflects off the top of the pipeline, creating a faint, sickly sheen on the silver jacket. It makes the world look even more alien, a landscape of metal and ice under a burning, silent sky. He thinks about the history of the men who walked this road before him. In the early days, they were rugged, weathered men who lived in trailers and ate tinned meat. They were a rough collection of dreamers and drifters, drawn to the north by the promise of high wages and the lure of the frontier. They left their mark in the way the gravel is packed, in the way the signs are bolted to the posts, in the very existence of the road. But the road is indifferent to them. The Arctic does not remember names. It only remembers the weight of the steel and the heat of the oil. The man feels like he is walking through a memory of a construction project, a lingering shadow of a massive effort that has long since settled into a routine. The routine is the only thing that survives. The routine is the only thing that keeps the oil moving and the man walking. His breath has formed a thick layer of ice on the front of his parka. He can feel the weight of it, a heavy, frozen plate that crackles whenever he looks down. He reaches up with a stiff mitten and brushes at it, but the ice is stubborn, fused to the fabric. He leaves it. It is another layer of insulation, a barrier of his own making. The cold is now a permanent part of his consciousness. It is not something he feels, it is something he is. He is a creature of 30 degrees below zero, a being of wool and leather and slowing blood. He watches the shadows of the pipe supports as they crawl across the snow. They are long and thin, like the legs of a giant spider. They seem to stretch out toward the mountains, reaching for a horizon that never comes. The pipe continues its zigzag journey. Every bend is a repetition of the last. Every VSM is a twin of the one before. The monotony is a heavy weight pressing down on his mind like the indigo sky. He finds comfort in it. There are no surprises here. There is only the steel, the gravel, and the hum. He focuses on the small details, the way a rivet has caught a single crystal of ice, the way the lantern light fades into the gray mist, the way his own shadow moves in front of him, a dark, distorted companion. The drawing is nearly complete in his mind, a long, winding corridor of blue and gray, with a single, tiny spark of orange moving slowly through the center. It is a quiet history. It is a boring history. It is the history of a man and a pipe, alone on the Dalton Highway, waiting for a morning that is still many miles away. The path begins to slope downward. It is a subtle incline, perhaps only a few degrees, but the man feels it in the slow, heavy shift of his center of gravity. The Dalton Highway follows the contours of the land like a patient, gray snake, and here, the road descends into a shallow basin where the air is noticeably stiller and several degrees colder. Cold air, being denser and heavier than warm air, pools in these low-lying pockets, creating a microenvironment of absolute biting stillness. The man enters this pool of shadow. The light of his lantern seems to struggle here, the amber glow shrinking as if the very air were trying to extinguish it. The ground beneath his feet is no longer just gravel. It is a mixture of silt and ice, frozen into a substance as hard as granite. He watches the way the lantern light grazes the surface of the road. In a soft pastel drawing, this would be represented by short, horizontal strokes of a pale cream color, barely touching the dark blue underpainting. The texture of the paper, the tooth, would catch the pigment, creating the illusion of a rough, frost-covered surface. Everything is a smudge of charcoal and slate. He approaches the first of several small bridges that span the braided channels of a frozen river. These are not grand, soaring suspension bridges. They are functional, low-profile structures made of heavy I-beams and thick timber decking. The history of these bridges is a history of modularity. In the mid-1970s, time was the greatest enemy of the project. Every day the oil remained in the ground was a day of lost revenue for the consortium of companies that formed Alyeska. To speed up the process, the bridges were designed to be prefabricated. They were built in sections in the south, then trucked up the haul road and bolted together in the freezing wind. The man stops at the edge of the bridge. He can see the massive bolts, their heads octagonal and heavy, coated in a thick layer of gray paint and white frost. Each bolt was torqued to a specific tension, a boring but vital calculation performed by men in heavy spectacles and fur-lined hoods. They worked in 12-hour shifts, their fingers numb inside their gloves, ensuring that the bridge could withstand the weight of a 100-ton truck and the relentless expansion of the ice below. Below the bridge, the river is a jagged graveyard of ice. This is the Jim River, or perhaps a nameless tributary that feeds into the Koyukuk. It doesn't matter. In the winter, all rivers are the same. They are motionless flows of frozen turquoise and white. The man looks down over the railing. The ice is not smooth. It is a chaotic jumble of overflow ice or off-phase. This occurs when the water beneath the frozen surface is pressurized, forcing its way through cracks and spreading out over the top, where it freezes instantly into a new layer. This process repeats throughout the winter, building up thick, layered plates of ice that can eventually grow high enough to touch the bottom of the bridge. The history of off-phase is a history of maintenance. During the construction years, crews had to monitor these river crossings constantly, sometimes using steam generators to melt the ice away from the bridge pilings. The sound of the steam, a high-pitched hiss in the sub-zero air, is a sound the man can almost hear in the silence. It is a sound of human heat fighting against the encroaching cold. The man resumes his walk across the bridge. The sound of his boots changes. The hollow snap of the gravel is replaced by the solid, resonant thud of wood and steel. The bridge vibrations are different from the road vibrations. Here, he can feel the wind more clearly as it whistles through the gaps in the timber. It is a thin, reedy sound like a flute with only one note. He counts his steps across the span, 34 steps. The length of the bridge is exactly 100 feet. He knows this because he has walked it 1,000 times. Every inch of this road is mapped in his muscles. He knows where the expansion joints are. He knows where the railing is slightly bent from a sliding truck in 1982. He knows the history of every dent and scratch on the metal. These are the small, boring facts that fill his mind, preventing it from drifting into the dangerous, empty spaces of the tundra. He focuses on the grain of the wood in the bridge decking, the way the frost has filled the cracks in the timber, creating a white map of age. The air becomes thick with diamond dust. These are tiny, unattached ice crystals that form in clear, cold weather. They are so light that they do not fall like snow. They hover, suspended in the air like a frozen mist. In the light of his lantern, the diamond dust becomes a swirling galaxy of miniature stars. Each crystal reflects the light with a sharp, pinpoint brilliance. It is a beautiful sight, but the man sees it only as a measure of temperature. For diamond dust to form, it must be at least 20 degrees below zero. Tonight, it is much colder. The dust settles on his eyelashes, creating a fringe of white frost that blurs his vision. He has to blink frequently to clear it. Each blink is a slow, heavy movement. The moisture on his eyes feels thick, as if it were on the verge of turning to slush. He adjusts his goggles, but the plastic has become so cold that it feels like it might shatter if he presses too hard. The world through the lens is a blur of navy and charcoal. The pipeline follows the bridge on its own separate set of supports. It hangs over the river, a silver arc that looks fragile against the massive backdrop of the mountains. Here, the insulation jacket is particularly important. The wind off the river is constant and biting. If the oil were to cool too much here, it would become thixotropic, a fancy engineering word for a substance that turns from a liquid to a gel when it stops moving. The history of the pipeline is haunted by the fear of a gel-up. If the pumps were to fail and the oil were to sit still in this cold, it would thicken into a black, impenetrable sludge. It would take weeks of heating and pressure to get it moving again. This is why the man walks. This is why the pumps in the distance hum. They are the heart and the man is the nerve, ensuring that the lifeblood of the system never stops flowing. He looks at the pipe's silver skin. In the pastel drawing, the artist would use a soft gray stick to create a long, smooth highlight along the top of the cylinder, then blend it into a deep, velvety black on the underside. The highlight would be tinged with the faint, ghostly green of the aurora, a subtle reflection of the sky. He thinks of the history of the camps that once stood near these river crossings, places like Old Man Camp and Prospect Creek. Prospect Creek holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in the United States, minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, set in January 1971. The man imagines the men in those camps. They lived in ATCO units, modular trailers that were bolted together to form long corridors of bunk rooms and mess halls. The air in the camps would have smelled of diesel, stale coffee, and wet wool. Outside, the world was a white void. Inside, the lights were always on, a fluorescent hum that never ceased. The history of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System is a history of these small, artificial islands of warmth. The men worked for weeks at a time, their world reduced to the cab of a bulldozer or the end of a welding torch. When they left behind only the gravel pads and the heavy, buried foundations. The man is the only one left to walk between these ghosts. He is the link between the era of creation and the era of endurance. His parka feels heavier now. The ice on the front has thickened, forming a solid plate that restricts his movement. His shoulders ache from the weight of the wool and the down. His layers are a complex system of thermal management. First, a thin layer of silk against the skin, then a heavy layer of merino wool, then a thick fleece. Finally, the Gore-Tex and down outer shell. Each layer is a barrier. Each layer is a history of textile engineering. He can feel the heat of his own body trapped between the wool and the fleece. It is a small, humid warmth, a stark contrast to the dry, soul-crushing cold only inches away. He moves his arms in a slow, circular motion to keep the blood flowing into his joints. The sound of the fabric rubbing together is a soft, rhythmic shush-shush. It is the sound of his own survival. It is a sound that matches the slow, steady hum of the oil moving through the pipe next to him. He reaches the end of the bridge. The gravel returns. He passes another mile marker. 246. One more mile. The numbers are small, but they are the only progress he can measure. In this landscape, there are no trees to mark the distance, no buildings to provide a sense of scale. There is only the pipe and the road. He stops for a moment to check the lantern's fuel. The glass is hot, but the air around it is so cold that he can see the convection currents. The way the heated air rises in a shimmering, distorted column. The fuel is low. He will need to refill it at the next shelter, a small, insulated shack located another 3 miles ahead. The thought of the shack provides a small, dull spark of motivation. It will be out of the wind. There will be a small electric heater. There will be a chair. He doesn't think about the warmth. He thinks about the lack of wind. In the Arctic, the absence of wind is a luxury. He begins the next mile. The road stretches out, a dark gray line between the blue-white drifts of snow. The mountains are still there, silent and indifferent, their peaks drawn in the softest of pastels against the darkening sky. The aurora has faded, leaving behind only the deep indigo of the vacuum. The man is a small, dark shape, moving slowly through a world of shadows. His breath follows him like a ghost, a white cloud that vanishes into the diamond dust. He focuses on the texture of his mittens, the way the leather has become stiff and unyielding. He focuses on the way his toes feel dead, heavy weights at the ends of his legs. This is the sensory reality of the walk. It is a reality of diminishing returns, of a body slowly losing its battle with the environment. But the pipeline continues. The vibration is there, a low-frequency reminder of the world beyond the ice. The drawing of this moment would be incredibly sparse. A vast field of dark, textured paper. At the bottom, a single smudged line of gray gravel. In the middle, a silver-gray cylinder, its form defined by a few careful highlights. And in the center, a tiny, orange-yellow dot of a lantern. The rest is darkness. The rest is the blue-gray void. The history of the pipeline walker is not a history of adventure. It is a history of steps. It is a history of checking rivets and watching pressure gauges. It is a history of silence. He continues his march, the sound of his boots a dry, hollow snap against the frozen earth. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The monotone of the walk is the monotone of the history itself, a long, slow, cold process of extraction and transportation. He is the witness to the process. He is the guardian of the silver vein. The bridge is now a memory of vibration beneath his heels, and the road has returned to its state of infinite, graveled patience. The transition from the timber decking back to the crushed rock is a subtle shift in the register of his footsteps, a low-frequency thud becoming a dry, hollow crackle. The air in this stretch of the Brooks Range feels even more compressed, as if the darkness itself were a physical weight pressing against the fiberglass insulation of the pipeline. In a soft pastel drawing on dark paper, this scene would be composed of layered strokes of Prussian blue and a tint of Payne's gray. blended together with a finger to create the illusion of a freezing fog that has no beginning and no end. The man is a silhouette of charcoal, his form defined only by the faint, warm amber glow emanating from the lantern at his side. The light is a small, bruised peach color in a universe of indigo. It catches the texture of the rime ice on the pipeline's jacket, turning the frozen moisture into a series of brilliant, microscopic diamonds that vanish as soon as he passes. The pipeline here is elevated high above the tundra, supported by VSMs that are anchored into a particularly stubborn patch of permafrost. The history of this specific mile of pipe is a history of thermal calculations. In 1975, the surveyors realized that the ice lenses beneath this section were unusually large, pockets of pure, ancient water frozen into the silt since the last glacial retreat. To disturb them would be to invite the collapse of the entire structure. Consequently, the supports here are deeper, more robust, and more heavily equipped with thermosiphons than any other section for 50 miles. The man looks up at the ammonia-filled tubes. In the dim light, they look like the vertical bars of a vast, industrial cage. They are silent, yet they are performing an immense amount of work, moving heat from the earth into the sky in a slow, invisible cycle. This is the boring reality of the Arctic's industrialization. It is a war of inches and degrees, fought with stationary equipment and chemical reactions that make no sound. He passes a microwave communications tower, a skeletal structure of rusted steel that rises into the dark like a jagged needle. The history of the TAPS communication system is a story of redundant technologies. Before the era of satellites, these towers were the only way to monitor the line's health. They bounced signals from station to station, carrying data on pressure, temperature, and flow rates through the mountain passes. The towers were built to withstand winds of over 100 miles per hour and temperatures that would shatter common steel. The man looks at the base of the tower, where the cables disappear into a heavy, reinforced concrete pad. The concrete is cracked, the fissures filled with ice that has expanded over decades, slowly prying the material apart. This is the chiaroscuro of the maintenance world, the interplay between the light of human endeavor and the deep, devouring shadow of natural decay. The tower hums with a faint, electrical vibration, a high-pitched whine that competes with the low-frequency roar of the oil. It is a lonely sound. The walk continues. The monotony of the gravel is interrupted only by the occasional bench in the road, a level area where the trucks of the 1970s would pull over to cool their brakes or wait for the winter storms to pass. The man stops at one of these benches. He can see the outlines of old tire tracks frozen into the permafrost, preserved for decades by the cold. They are like fossils in the mud, a record of a time when this road was a chaotic artery of progress. Now they are just textures for a pastel drawing, long parallel lines of deep violet in the blue-gray snow. He feels the weight of his duty in the stillness. He is not just checking for leaks. He is checking for the persistence of the system itself. If he stops walking, the system feels less real. His movement is what gives the road its purpose. Ahead, a small, dark shape begins to resolve itself from the gloom. It is a maintenance shelter, known to the crews as a shack. It is a simple, rectangular box made of corrugated steel, bolted to a gravel pad and anchored with heavy guy wires. The history of these shacks is a history of survival. They were placed every few miles during the construction to provide a refuge for workers caught in whiteouts, those moments when the wind and snow erase the horizon and turn the world into a spinning, blinding void. The man approaches the door. The handle is a heavy, industrial latch, coated in a thick layer of gray paint and white frost. He has to strike it with the heel of his mitten to break the ice seal. The sound is a sharp, metallic clack that echoes across the tundra, a sudden intrusion into the silence. The interior of the shack is a study in stillness. When he opens the door, the lantern light spills into a room that smells of cold metal, ozone, and old, dry dust. The air inside is only marginally warmer than the air outside, but it is still. The lack of wind feels like a physical relief, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He sets the lantern on a small metal table that is bolted to the floor. The table's surface is scratched and worn, the bare metal showing through the green paint in a series of silver lines. In the soft, flickering light, the room looks like a vintage sketch. There is a single wooden chair, a small electric baseboard heater that emits a faint, clicking sound as it struggles against the cold, and a shelf containing a few basic tools and a logbook. The man sits. The movement is slow, a gradual folding of his stiffened limbs. He can hear his joints pop in the silence. He removes his mittens, his hands appearing pale and ghostly in the amber light. His fingers are clumsy, the tips numb and white. He reaches for a gallon jug of kerosene kept in a locker under the table. This is the ritual of the midpoint. He unscrews the cap of the lantern, the metal cold enough to sting his skin. He pours the fuel with a steady, practiced hand, the liquid gurgling softly as it fills the reservoir. This is the boring history of light in the wilderness. It requires fuel, it requires maintenance, and it requires a human hand to keep it burning. The scent of the kerosene is sharp and oily, a familiar, industrial perfume that masks the scent of the frost. While the lantern is being refilled, he looks at the logbook. The pages are yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a dull brown. The entries are repetitive, a litany of all clear, pressure steady, and wind north. There are names in the book he hasn't seen in years, men who have retired to the south, to places where the sun shines in the winter and the ground is soft. Their handwriting is a collection of slanted lines and hurried loops, a record of their presence in this tiny metal box. He adds his own entry, mile 248, routine check, no anomalies. The scratching of the pencil is a loud, dry sound in the small space. It is a humble addition to the history of the Dalton Highway, a single line in a story of 800 miles. He leans back in the chair and stares at the corrugated walls. The shadows cast by the lantern are long and distorted, moving slightly as the flame flickers. He thinks about the welds in the pipe outside. There are over 100,000 of them on the main line. Each one was performed by a welder who spent hours in a small, heated tent, shielding the arc from the wind. The history of those welds is a history of precision under pressure. If one weld fails, the entire system fails. The man feels the weight of that precision. He is the one who monitors the result of that labor. He is the one who ensures that the 40-year-old steel continues to hold back the pressure of the Earth's blood. The hum of the pipeline is audible even inside the shack, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrates through the floor and into the soles of his boots. It is a reminder that there is no true rest here. The oil never stops moving, and therefore the man cannot stop for long. He stands up, his muscles groaning at the change in position. He puts his mittens back on, the leather feeling cold and stiff against his warmed skin. He picks up the lantern, its reservoir now full and its flame steady. He moves toward the door, hesitant to leave the stillness of the shack but driven by the internal clock of his duty. When he opens the door, the cold hits him like a physical blow. It is a wall of air that sucks the warmth from his lungs and turns his breath back into a cloud of white needles. He steps out onto the gravel, the snow crust crunching under his boots with a sound like breaking glass. The shack door closes behind him with a dull, heavy thud, the latch clicking back into place. He is alone again. The road ahead is a long, straight line of gray pastel on a dark blue background. The mountains have shifted their position slightly, their peaks now appearing as sharp charcoal triangles against the indigo sky. The aurora has vanished completely, leaving the stars to shine with a hard, cold brilliance. The man resumes his pace. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The monotone of the walk returns, a hypnotic rhythm that numbs the mind as the cold numbs the body. He focuses on the texture of the pipeline's jacket, the way the light reflects off the rivets, the way the shadows of the VSMs stretch out across the road. Each support is a milestone. Each mile is a victory. The drawing of this part of the journey would be a study in the contrast between the small, interior world of the shack and the infinite, external world of the tundra. The shack would be a tiny, dark rectangle with a single, glowing window of amber. The man would be a small, dark figure emerging from the door, his shadow stretching out for yards across the blue-tinted snow. The texture of the paper would be used to represent the rough, wind-blown drifts and the jagged edges of the mountains. It is a quiet, heavy scene, a depiction of a man who is a part of the history he is walking through. He is the pipeline walker, a silent element in a vast, frozen landscape of steel and ice, moving slowly through the night toward a destination that is always just beyond the next horizon. The hum of the oil follows him, a mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the Brooks Range. The transition back into the open air is a slow, suffocating surrender to the geography of the North. As the door of the maintenance shack clicks shut behind him, the man is once again enveloped by a world that is 99% shadow. The air here does not just touch the skin, it searches for the smallest vulnerability in the weave of the wool, the tiniest gap in the leather, the microscopic pores of the Gore-Tex. It is a patient, invasive force. In a vintage-colored pencil drawing, this moment would be rendered with a heavy application of dark Prussian blue, layered over a base of charcoal. The artist would use a blunt, soft-leaded pencil to create the texture of the night air, making it look thick and granular, as if the darkness itself were composed of billions of tiny, frozen particles. The man's lantern, now refilled and burning with a steady, oily fragrance, is a solitary, warm smudge of ochre in a universe of cold, receding tones. The light does not pierce the dark. It merely exists within it, a fragile bubble of amber that moves slowly along the silver-gray line of the pipeline. The road here begins to ascend toward the foothills of the Adigun Pass. This is the most treacherous stretch of the Dalton, a place where the history of human engineering meets the absolute limit of natural endurance. But before the Dalton was a permanent gravel spine, there was the Hickle Highway. The man thinks of this as he walks, his boots finding the familiar, uneven rhythm of the crushed rock. The history of the Hickle Highway is a boring history of failure and muddy regret. In the winter of 1968 and 1969, before the pipeline was even a finalized blueprint, Governor Walter Hickle ordered a winter road to be cut from Livengood to the North Slope. It was not a road in the traditional sense. It was a scar. Bulldozers simply scraped the snow and the delicate tundra mat away, exposing the permafrost to the sun. It was a 400-mile track of raw, frozen earth. The trucks that used it in that first winter were pioneers of a sort, moving through a white void with no support and no hope of rescue if they broke down. The man looks at the current road, the modern Dalton, and sees the lesson of the Hickle Highway written in the depth of the gravel. When the summer of 1969 arrived, The Dalton Highway did not remain a road. Without the insulating layer of snow and vegetation, the permafrost began to melt. The road became a canal of black, thigh-deep mud, a literal river of thawed silt that could swallow a tractor-trailer whole. It was an environmental disaster of the most boring and predictable kind, a failure to respect the thermodynamics of the soil. The man walks on 6 feet of carefully layered gravel, a massive, insulating blanket that ensures the heat of the sun and the weight of the trucks never reach the ice lenses below. This is the true history of the North, the history of learning how to stay on top of the ground rather than falling through it. The drawing of the road surface here would require a fine, gray pencil, drawing each individual stone as a rounded, frozen entity, held in place by the dark, frozen mortar of the silt. The pipeline here is lower to the ground, its supports shortened to account for the increasing slope. The man has to lean slightly forward, his center of gravity shifting to accommodate the rise in elevation. He can feel the strain in his calves, a dull, repetitive ache that matches the rhythm of his breathing. His breath is a constant companion, a white, billowing flag that marks his progress. In the still air of the foothills, the vapor hangs for a long time, a ghostly trail that marks where he has been. It is a soft, pastel white, blending into the dark blue of the sky. The sound of the oil inside the pipe is different here, too. The pumps at Station 4, many miles to the north, are pushing the crude uphill. The vibration is more intense, a higher frequency hum that he can feel through the soles of his boots. It is the sound of millions of pounds of liquid fighting gravity. It is a heavy, industrial groan that never ceases. He passes an anchor support. Unlike the sliding shoes he encountered in the flats, the anchor support is a massive, rigid structure of steel and concrete that clamps the pipe firmly in place. These anchors are the skeleton of the system, the points from which all expansion and contraction are measured. The history of the anchor support is a history of metallurgy and structural integrity. Each one is designed to withstand millions of pounds of force. In the dim lantern light, the anchor looks like a medieval fortress, its thick steel plates bolted together with rivets the size of a man's fist. The metal is coated in a dull gray epoxy that has been sandblasted by decades of wind and ice. The man stops to inspect the base. He looks for stress whitening, tiny, pale marks in the paint that would indicate the metal is under too much tension. There are none. There is only the rime ice, which has grown in a thick, feathery crust over the leeward side of the support. The ice looks like a collection of white ferns, a frozen garden growing on a machine. The visual landscape is becoming more vertical. The mountains of the Brooks Range are no longer distant shapes. They are looming presences that block out the stars. They are drawn in the softest of pastels, shades of indigo, charcoal, and a very faint, cold violet. There are no trees here, only the tundra forest of dwarf willow and birch, which are currently buried under 4 feet of wind-packed snow. The man looks out over the white expanse. It is not a flat white. It is a landscape of textures, of drifts that look like frozen waves, and sastrugi, sharp, wind-carved ridges that resemble the scales of a giant fish. The lantern light catches the tips of these ridges, creating long, thin shadows that stretch out toward the pipe. Chiaroscuro, the play of light and dark. The man is a small, moving element in a grand, static composition. He is the only thing that changes in a drawing that has been the same for 10,000 years. His physical condition is a matter of managed degradation. The cold has moved past the outer layers of his clothing and is now working on the air pockets between the wool and his skin. He can feel the temperature of his core dropping, a slow, inevitable cooling that makes his thoughts feel heavy and viscous, like the oil itself. He counts his steps to keep his mind sharp. 1,042. 1,043. He knows that at 2,000 steps, he will reach a small wooden marker that indicates a buried fiber optic cable. This is another layer of boring history. Alongside the pipe, buried in the frozen ground, is a thin strand of glass that carries the data of the modern world. It is a silent, invisible neighbor to the loud, heavy oil. The man imagines the pulses of light moving through the glass at the speed of thought, carrying messages from the north to the south. It is a strange contrast. The ancient, heavy carbon of the oil and the weightless, modern light of the fiber optics, both moving through the same frozen silence. The wind begins to pick up as he gains elevation. It is not a gusting wind, but a steady, relentless flow of air from the north. It carries the diamond dust in long, horizontal streamers that look like the brushstrokes of a white pastel pencil. The dust hits his goggles with a tiny, metallic sound, a million microscopic impacts every second. He lowers his head, tucking his chin into the frozen collar of his parka. The world is reduced to the circle of gravel at his feet and the silver jacket of the pipe at his side. The hum of the pipeline is joined by the whistle of the wind through the fins of the thermosiphons. It is a discordant duet, a mechanical roar and a natural shriek, blended together into a single white noise that fills his head. He feels the weight of the silence behind the noise. It is the silence of the mountains, a silence that has no end. He thinks about the history of the pipeliners, the men who actually laid this steel in the mid-70s. They were a breed of men who lived in a world of constant movement and noise. They operated side booms, massive tractors that moved in tandem to lower the welded sections of pipe into the ditch or onto the supports. The coordination required was immense. If one operator moved too fast, the pipe would buckle. If one moved too slow, the weight would tip the machines. It was a slow-motion dance of heavy iron. The man imagines the scene, the bright yellow of the caterpillars against the deep blue of the winter twilight, the black smoke from the exhausts rising into the clear air, the shouts of the foreman lost in the roar of the engines. It was a time of immense, noisy energy. Now that energy is gone. All that remains is the product of that labor, the silver line that he guards with his slow, quiet walk. He is the caretaker of their exertion. He reaches the marker for the fiber optic cable. It is a simple, weather-beaten piece of wood, painted a faded orange. He stops and clears the frost from the surface. The wood is rough and splintered, the grain raised by the constant cycle of freezing and thawing. He feels the texture through his mittens. It is a small, human touch in a world of steel and ice. He checks his watch, but the crystal is frosted over and the liquid crystal display is sluggish, the numbers fading in and out as the battery struggles in the cold. Time does not matter here. Only distance matters. Only the next support matters. He wipes the watch face with a thumb, but the numbers remain a ghost. He abandons the effort. He knows the time by the position of the stars, or rather, by the depth of the darkness. It is the middle of the night, the deepest part of the winter, the heart of the long dark. The drawing of this moment would be incredibly dense. The dark surface of the paper would be nearly covered in layers of blue and black, with only the thinnest lines of light to define the form of the man and the pipe. The artist would use a white pencil to draw the wind, long, sweeping arcs that cut across the composition, blurring the edges of everything. It is a scene of profound, heavy labor. The man is not walking. He is pushing against the world. Each step is an exertion of will against the environment. The monotony is his shield. He does not think about the miles remaining. He thinks about the texture of the gravel. He thinks about the hum of the oil. He thinks about the way the light of his lantern catches the rivets on the pipe's jacket, turning each one into a tiny, amber star. The slope continues to steepen. The road begins to curve, following the base of a massive, shadowed ridge. Here, the pipeline leaves the side of the road and takes a more direct route up the hillside, its VSMs marching up the slope like the legs of a giant centipede. The man follows the maintenance trail, a narrow path of packed snow that runs directly beneath the pipe. The shadows here are absolute. The lantern light reflects off the bottom of the pipe, creating a canopy of dim, orange light above him. It feels like walking through a tunnel made of steel and ice. The air is even colder here, trapped under the mass of the pipe. He can feel the cold radiating from the metal, a deep industrial chill that pierces his layers. He keeps moving. The rhythm of his boots is the only clock that works. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The pipeline walker continues his journey, a silent witness to a boring history, a shadow moving through a world of soft pastels and deep, indigo dreams. The hum of the oil is his only company, a steady, vibrating pulse that tells him the world is still alive, somewhere far to the south. The climb is no longer a suggestion. It is a physical confrontation. The road begins to twist, following the contours of the Dietrich River Valley as it narrows into the throat of the Brooks Range. This is the approach to the Adigun Pass, the highest point on the Dalton, where the mountains stop being distant silhouettes and become towering, vertical walls of slate and shadow. In a soft pastel drawing on dark indigo paper, this section would be defined by the pressure of the pencils. The artist would press hard with the charcoal and the deep navy sticks to create the mass of the peaks, then use a sharp white pencil to draw the impossibly thin lines of the snow-filled couloirs that scar the mountain faces. The man is a speck of soot against this monumental backdrop. His lantern light is a tiny, flickering ember, a pale orange dot that barely manages to illuminate the gravel 10 feet in front of him. The light creates a shallow dome of visibility, outside of which the world is an infinite, cold mystery. The air here is thinner, sharper, and carries the weight of the heights. Every breath is a conscious effort, a slow expansion of the lungs against the constricting cold of the parka. The pipeline undergoes a significant change in this section. For hundreds of miles, it has marched across the tundra on its silver legs, but here, as it prepares to cross the continental divide, the engineers were forced to reconsider. The history of the Adigun crossing is a boring history of geotechnical caution. Because of the extreme risk of avalanches and the steepness of the terrain, large sections of the pipe were buried. This was not a simple task. To bury a hot oil pipe in permafrost is to invite the earth to melt and the pipe to sink. The man reaches the transition station, a heavy concrete structure where the pipe dives into the ground. In the dim light, the station looks like a tomb, its gray walls coated in a thick, velvety layer of frost. The man stops to inspect the seals where the steel disappears into the earth. This buried section is encased in a special brine-cooled system. A series of refrigerated pipes run alongside the oil line, carrying a chilled solution to keep the surrounding soil frozen. It is a machine designed to keep the earth dead and cold, a mechanical preservation of the ice. The man listens to the faint, electrical hum of the refrigeration units. It is a high, lonely whine that contrasts with the deep, vibrating roar of the oil. The history of the Adigun Pass is the history of the big rigs. Before the pipeline, this pass was a myth, a place where only the most daring pilots and dog mushers ventured. When the road was first cut, The grade was so steep that trucks had to be towed up by bulldozers in a slow, grinding procession of yellow iron and black smoke. The man walks past a sand shed, a small, weathered wooden structure filled with grit to be spread on the ice. The history of the sand is a history of friction. Thousands of tons of crushed rock are hauled up here every year, only to be ground into dust by the tires of the haul road truckers. The man touches the rough wood of the shed. The grain is raised and silvered by the wind, feeling like the skin of an ancient animal. In a pastel sketch, this shed would be a study in texture, short, jagged strokes of charcoal to represent the splinters, and a dusting of light gray for the salt crust that covers the floor. It is a boring, functional building, a silent witness to the struggle of engines against the incline. The man reaches the shelf. This is a relatively flat area of the road, a brief respite before the final, brutal climb to the summit. The shelf is a desolate place, a plateau of windswept gravel and frozen silt. The wind here is different. It does not whistle so much as it moans, a low-frequency vibration that seems to come from the mountains themselves. The man's boots make a different sound on the shelf. The gravel is thinner here, and the sound is sharper, a clink-clink of stone on stone. He can feel the vibration of the pipeline even through the earth. Since it is buried here, the sound is muffled, a subterranean growl that feels like a sleeping giant's breath. He follows the line of marker poles, tall, flexible wands of fiberglass that stick out of the snow to show where the pipe is buried. They look like the whiskers of a buried beast, swaying slightly in the relentless wind. The visual landscape on the shelf is a study in monochromatic minimalism. The sky is a deep, saturated black blue, the color of a bruise. The ground is a pale, ghostly gray, the color of ash. There are no shadows here because there is no light other than the man's lantern. The world is a two-dimensional plane of dark and light. He feels a sense of profound vertigo, as if he were walking on the surface of a dead moon. He focuses on his feet, the way the rubber soles of his boots flex with every step. The movement is slow, rhythmic, and hypnotic. 1, 2, 1, 2. The monotony is a comfort. It replaces the need for thought. He is no longer a man with a name or a past. He is a set of movements, a biological clock ticking away the miles. The history of his walk is the only history that matters now, a history of steps taken and breaths exhaled into the void. He thinks about the history of the Adigun name itself. It is a word from the Inupiat people, meaning the place where the wind blows through the pass. For thousands of years, hunters moved through this gap in the mountains, following the caribou. They left no roads, no pipes, no concrete stations. They left only stories and the occasional pile of stones. The man feels like an intruder in this ancient silence. The pipeline is a loud, heavy, modern interruption, yet the cold is slowly reclaiming the steel. The frost on the transition station is inches thick. The rivets on the marker poles are being eaten by rust and ice. The Arctic is patient. It does not fight the pipe. It simply waits for the energy to run out. The man is the only thing keeping the energy focused. He is the observer who prevents the system from fading into the background of the mountains. The cold on the shelf is more aggressive. It is a dry, desiccating cold that pulls the moisture from his skin even through his layers. He can feel the bridge of his nose becoming stiff, the skin tightening until it feels like parchment. He adjusts his face mask, the fabric now a solid plate of ice from his breath. The sound of the ice cracking as he moves his jaw is like the sound of dry twigs breaking. He doesn't feel pain. The cold has moved past pain into a state of deep, heavy numbness. His hands, inside the deerskin mittens, are curled into loose fists, the fingers moving in a slow, automatic cycle of clenching and unclenching. This is the Arctic shimmy, a subtle internal movement that keeps the blood from pooling. It is a boring, repetitive exercise, but it is the difference between keeping his fingers and losing them to the frost. He passes a low-point drain, a specialized valve used to clear the line of any water or sediment. The valve is housed in a buried vault, marked only by a heavy steel hatch that sits flush with the gravel. The man stops and clears the snow from the hatch. The metal is freezing to the touch, the cold biting through his mittens. He doesn't open it, he simply listens. He presses his ear toward the ground. He can hear the fluid moving, the thick, viscous slide of the oil, the occasional clunk of a pig, a mechanical cleaning device moving through the line. The pig is a boring piece of technology, a heavy rubber and steel plug that is pushed through the pipe by the pressure of the oil. It scrapes the walls, clearing away the wax and scale that build up over time. The history of the pig is a history of maintenance, a hidden, internal cleaning process that happens miles beneath the man's feet. He imagines the pig moving in the dark, a blind, heavy traveler in a steel tunnel. He feels a strange connection to it. They are both moving through the dark, performing a task that no one sees. The drawing of this scene would be composed of horizontal bands of color, a thick band of dark charcoal for the ground, a thinner band of deep indigo for the sky, and in the middle, a single blurred line of orange-yellow for the lantern light. There would be no vertical lines, no trees, no buildings. Only the man, a small, dark vertical stroke, breaking the horizontal monotony. The texture of the pastel would be rough, representing the wind-blown snow and the jagged gravel. It is a quiet, heavy image of endurance. The history of the pipeline walker is a history of being the only vertical thing in a horizontal world. As he moves toward the end of the shelf, the final ascent to the Adigun summit begins to loom. The road tilts upward again, this time at a staggering 10% grade. This is the big climb. The pipeline, still buried here, follows the road in a straight, uncompromising line. The man feels the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. The air is even thinner now, the oxygen molecules sparse and cold. He slows his pace. He matches his steps to the beat of his heart. Thump snap, thump snap. The sound of his heart is a dull, internal drum. It is the only warm thing in the world. He looks back once toward the south. The road he has walked is a gray smudge, vanishing into the charcoal mist of the Dietrich Valley. There are no lights, no signs of life, no evidence that anyone else has ever been here. He is alone with the pipe and the frost. The history of the construction of this final mile is a story of sheer industrial stubbornness. The trench for the pipe had to be blasted out of solid rock. For months, the sound of dynamite echoed through the pass, a series of sharp, violent cracks that shattered the ancient silence. The men worked in 24-hour darkness, their floodlights creating a surreal, artificial day against the snow. They laid the pipe, poured the brine coolant, and buried it all under tons of shot rock. Now the silence has returned, deeper and more profound than before. The man walks over the site of those explosions, his boots finding the jagged edges of the blasted stone. The rock is a dark, crystalline gray, looking like graphite in the light of his lantern. It is a boring, gray history, written in stone and steel. He adjusts the lantern. The flame is steady, but the light seems to be getting dimmer, as if the altitude were starving the fire of oxygen. He doesn't mind. He knows the way. He knows the texture of the road. He knows the hum of the oil. He is the pipeline walker, the silent guardian of the silver vein, moving slowly through the blue-gray dark of the Brooks Range. The monotony of the walk is his meditation, a slow, cold prayer to the god of maintenance. He continues his march, one step at a time, toward the summit of the world, where the wind blows through the pass and the stars shine with a hard, indifferent light. The summit of the Adigun Pass is not a peak, but a notch, a narrow, jagged gap in the spine of the continent where the world seems to hold its breath. At 4,800 feet above the level of the distant frozen sea, the air has a different quality. It is thin, stripped of its weight, yet it carries a cold that is sharper and more predatory than the cold of the valleys. The man reaches the crest of the road, his heart a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. He stops. Here, the continental divide is marked by a simple, weathered sign, but the true marker is the wind. It funnels through the pass with a constant, low-frequency roar, a sound like a distant freight train that never arrives. In a soft pastel drawing on dark, textured paper, this place would be a study in the most extreme contrasts of the Arctic night. The sky is no longer indigo. It is a deep, void-like charcoal, so dark it seems to absorb the very light of the stars. The mountains on either side are vertical walls of slate, their faces drawn with heavy, blunt strokes of black graphite, scarred by the white, jagged lines of frozen couloirs. The man is a tiny, amber-lit smudge at the bottom of a great, dark throat of stone. The history of this notch is a history of raw, industrial violence. In the mid-1970s, the Adigun Pass was the greatest obstacle in the path of the silver vein. The engineers of the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company looked at these vertical walls and saw a problem of logistics and metallurgy. To bring the pipe over the pass, they couldn't simply lay it on the surface. The risk of avalanches was too great. Every winter, the snow accumulates on these peaks until it reaches a critical mass, eventually releasing in a white, thundering wall of kinetic energy that can snap steel supports like dry kindling. So, the decision was made to bury the pipe deep within the bedrock of the pass. The history of the Adigun Crossing is a story of 1974, of men working in 24-hour darkness with jackhammers and dynamite. They blasted a trench through the solid sedimentary rock, a deep, narrow scar that was then lined with specialized, low-temperature bedding material. The man walks over this buried secret now, his boots making a sharp, metallic clack on the shot rock that covers the line. He can feel the warmth of the oil even through 5 feet of earth and stone, a faint, ghostly vibration that rises through the soles of his feet. The visual texture of the road at the summit is unique. The wind is so constant here that it scours the gravel clean of loose snow, leaving behind a surface of polished, gray stone and black ice. In the light of his lantern, the road looks like a mosaic of dark jewels. The lantern flame, starving for oxygen in the thin air, flickers with a desperate, rhythmic pulse. The amber light catches the edges of the blasted rock, the overburden that protects the pipe. Each piece of stone is a sharp-edged fragment of the mountain's history, coated in a fine, translucent glaze of rime. The man watches the way the light moves across the ground. It is a slow, liquid movement, the shadows of the rocks lengthening and shortening as he passes. He is a surveyor of the minute, a collector of boring details. He looks for settlement, the way the ground might sag if the heat of the oil were to begin thawing the deep permafrost. He looks for heave, the way the ice might push the rocks upward. There is none. The engineering of the 70s remains a silent, heavy success. As he begins the long descent toward the north slope, the man enters Avalanche Alley. This is a 3-mile stretch of the road where the mountain walls are at their steepest. The history of this stretch is written in the avalanche guns, the 105 howitzers and recoilless rifles used by the Department of Transportation to trigger controlled slides before they become a danger to the road. The man passes one of the gun emplacements, a concrete pad that looks like a prehistoric altar in the dark. It is empty now, but the history of the shells is there in the silence. During the construction years, the sound of the guns was a constant accompaniment to the wind, a series of dull, echoing booms that signaled the struggle between man and gravity. Now, there is only the silence of the snow. The snow on the upper slopes is a pale, ghostly blue in the starlight, a heavy, unstable blanket that hangs over the road. The man does not look up. To look up is to acknowledge the fragility of his position. He keeps his eyes on the buried line, following the orange marker poles that march down the incline. The boring history of the pipe's metallurgy is his focus now. The steel used in the Adigun section is X65 grade, a high-strength, low-alloy steel designed to remain ductile even at -50 degrees. If the steel were too brittle, the pressure of the earth and the vibration of the oil would cause it to shatter. The welds here were performed with a specialized, low-hydrogen process, each one inspected with ultrasonic waves to ensure a perfect, seamless bond. The man thinks about those welds, miles beneath his feet, holding back the immense pressure of the moving crude. The oil is gaining momentum now, fueled by the gravity of the descent. The hum in the ground has shifted in pitch, becoming a higher, more resonant whine. It is the sound of millions of barrels of liquid energy falling toward the Arctic Ocean. It is a heavy, industrial roar that is muffled by the earth, a subterranean heartbeat that matches the rhythm of his walk. The drawing of this descent would be a masterpiece of chiaroscuro. The artist would use the side of a black pastel stick to create the massive, looming shadows of the peaks, then use a sharp, white pencil to draw the sastrugi on the lower slopes, those wind-carved ridges of snow that look like frozen waves. The lantern light would be a small, warm circle of peach orange at the bottom of the frame, surrounded by a universe of deep, velvety blues. The texture of the paper would be allowed to show through, creating the illusion of falling diamond dust. The man is a vertical line of charcoal, leaning slightly back against the slope, his movements slow and deliberate. Every step is a negotiation with friction. He places his boots carefully, feeling for the grip of the rubber on the frozen silt. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The cadence is the same as it was in the valleys, but the stakes are higher here. A slip on the Adigun Pass is a long, cold journey into the dark. He thinks about the history of the Adigun camp, which once stood at the base of the pass. It was a cluster of modular trailers, a small, brightly lit island of human activity in the middle of this vertical wilderness. The men who lived there were the mountain crews, a specialized group of operators and mechanics who kept the pass open during the winter. They lived on a diet of heavy proteins and strong coffee, their world reduced to the glow of their headlights and the sound of their engines. They were the ones who carved this road out of the slate, who laid the pipe in the trench, who fought the avalanches with guns and fire. Now, the camp is gone, replaced by a flat gravel pad and a few rusted remains of cable. The man is the only one left to remember their labor. He is the witness to their engineering, the one who ensures that their welds and their trenches continue to do the boring, necessary work of transportation. The cold on the northern side of the pass is different. It is more humid, carrying a faint, salty scent from the distant Beaufort Sea. It clings to the man's parka, forming a thick white crust of hoarfrost that looks like a layer of lace. The ice on his face mask has grown so heavy that he has to support it with his chin. He can feel the moisture of his own breath freezing against his cheeks, a slow, icy pressure that turns his skin to stone. He doesn't rub it. He knows that to rub it is to damage the tissue. He simply accepts the cold as a part of his anatomy. He is a creature of the pass, a being of wool and leather and slowing blood. He moves his fingers inside his mittens, the same rhythmic clenching that has become a second nature. Open, close, open, close. The small fire of his circulation is all he has left. He passes a check valve, another massive piece of machinery buried beneath the road. This valve is designed to prevent the oil from flowing backward in the event of a pump failure at Station 4. The history of the check valve is a history of gravity management. If the flow were to reverse on this steep incline, the pressure would be enough to burst the line at the bottom of the hill. The valve is a silent sentinel, a heavy steel gate that only opens in one direction. The man stops to listen. He can hear the soft, rhythmic clack-clack of the internal mechanism, a sound that is lost to everyone but him. It is a boring sound. It is a functional sound. It is the sound of safety. He records the sound in his mind, adding it to the long, gray history of the night. The road continues to drop, a long, winding ribbon of gray on a dark blue background. The mountains begin to recede, their peaks losing their verticality and becoming rounded, shadowed hills. The air becomes denser, heavier, and the man feels a slight relief in his chest as the oxygen levels rise. But the cold remains. It pools in the valleys of the North Slope, a dense, blue fog of absolute zero. The man watches his shadow move in front of him, cast by the lantern. It is a long, distorted shape that stretches out for yards across the frozen road. It looks like a ghost, a dark companion that leads him further into the winter. He follows it. He has no choice. The pipeline is his guide and the road is his path. The drawing of this part of the journey would be a study in the transition from the vertical to the horizontal. The sharp, jagged lines of the summit would give way to the long, sweeping curves of the foothills. The colors would shift from the charcoal blacks of the rock to the deep, saturated blues of the tundra snow. The lantern light would remain the same, a tiny, warm spark of orange in a world of receding tones. It is a quiet history. It is a heavy history. It is the history of a man and a pipe, moving through the most dangerous part of the world with a slow, boring, and absolutely vital persistence. The hum of the oil is his only company, a steady, vibrating roar that tells him the journey is far from over, but the summit is behind him. He is the pipeline walker, and the North Slope is waiting. The descent from the Adigun Pass is a slow surrender to the horizontal. As the man leaves the jagged, vertical shadows of the mountains behind, the world begins to stretch out, lengthening into a vast, featureless plain of indigo and slate. This is the beginning of the North Slope, a geographical shelf that tilts imperceptibly toward the Arctic Ocean, hundreds of miles to the north. In a soft pastel drawing on dark, textured paper, this transition would be rendered by a gradual softening of the lines. The sharp, charcoal black peaks of the Brooks Range would be blended into a hazy, navy blue background, while the foreground would be dominated by long, horizontal strokes of a pale, ghostly gray. The man's lantern remains the only warm element in the composition, a small, trembling smudge of amber that casts a shallow, flickering light onto the frozen gravel. The light reveals the texture of the road, a mosaic of crushed silt and jagged stone, each piece encased in a thin, translucent layer of ice. The air here is no longer moving in the violent gusts of the pass. Instead, it has settled into a stagnant, heavy cold that feels like a physical weight against the man's chest. It is a cold that does not bite so much as it occupies, filling every fold of his parka and every fiber of his wool with a dense, heat-stealing silence. The history of the North Slope section of the pipeline is a history of logistics and modularity. In the mid-1970s, as the line pushed north of the mountains, the engineers were faced with the challenge of building on continuous permafrost. Unlike the interior of Alaska, where the frozen ground is intermittent. The north slope is a solid block of ice and silt that extends nearly 1,000 feet into the earth. To build here was to build on a foundation of frozen water. The man looks at the pipeline, which has emerged from its buried transit through the pass, and is once again elevated on its silver legs. The history of these vertical support members is a boring history of thermal integrity. Each support is a freeze-back piling designed to become a permanent part of the frozen earth. During construction, the holes were drilled, the supports were lowered, and a special sand and water slurry was poured in, which then froze solid, locking the steel into the permafrost. The man checks the base of a support, his lantern light catching the way the frost has built up around the steel. It looks like a white, crystalline collar, a frozen grip that has held firm for over 50 years. He touches the metal. It is so cold it feels like it is vibrating, a sensation that is indistinguishable from the low-frequency hum of the oil moving within. The road here follows the Sagavanirktok River, known simply to the truckers and pipe walkers as the Sag. The history of the Sag is a history of braiding and ice. The river is not a single channel, but a wide, shallow expanse of shifting gravel and water that freezes into a chaotic jumble of turquoise plates in the winter. The man walks alongside the riverbed, though it is invisible under the drifts of snow. He can tell it is there by the change in the wind and the subtle shift in the terrain. The pipeline crosses the river's floodplains on massive, long-span bridges, their steel girders painted a dull, industrial gray that has faded to a chalky charcoal. In a pastel sketch, these bridges would be represented by heavy, geometric lines of dark gray, their forms blurred by the constant presence of diamond dust in the air. The man stops at the edge of a crossing. He listens. Underneath the roar of the wind and the hum of the pipe, there is a faint, rhythmic boom that occurs every few minutes. It is the sound of the river ice expanding and cracking under the pressure of the dropping temperature, a deep, subterranean groan that echoes through the frozen gravel. It is a sound of the earth moving in its sleep, a slow-motion tectonic event that has been repeating for millennia. His physical state is one of managed, rhythmic suffering. The cold has moved through his outer layers, past the heavy down of his parka, and is now pressing against the thick wool of his sweaters. He can feel the heat of his own body being drawn out of him, a slow, invisible evaporation. To combat this, he focuses on the minutiae of his equipment. He checks the tension of his boot laces, the way the leather has frozen into a rigid, unyielding shell. He checks the weight of his mittens, which are now heavy with a layer of rime ice that has formed on the deer-hide palms. The history of his clothing is a history of textile evolution: silk, wool, fleece, down, and Gore-Tex, all layered together to create a microclimate that is just barely enough to sustain life. He moves his arms in a slow, circular motion, a repetitive exercise designed to keep the blood from cooling in his extremities. The sound of his parka rubbing against itself is a dry, synthetic shush that is the only intimate sound in the vast, echoing silence of the tundra. He counts his breaths. 1, 2, 3. Each exhale is a white cloud that lingers in the still air, a ghostly record of his passage. The visual landscape of the North Slope is a study in whiteout geography. Even when the sky is clear, the horizon is often lost in a haze of suspended ice crystals. The man feels a sense of profound isolation, as if he were walking through a dream drawn with a soft, white pastel stick on a sheet of dark gray paper. The textures are all he has to guide him: the rough gravel of the road, the smooth, cold steel of the pipe, the soft, powdery drifts of snow that have accumulated against the leeward side of the supports. He reaches a mile marker, 274, The numbers are barely visible under a layer of frost. He reaches out and brushes the ice away with a gloved hand. The sound is a soft, dry hiss, like sand on silk. The history of these markers is a history of distance and measurement, a way for the men of the 70s to keep track of their progress across a landscape that offers no landmarks. Each mile is a victory over the void. Each number is a confirmation that the world still exists. He thinks about the history of Pump Station 4, which he passed hours ago. It is the top of the world station, a massive industrial complex that looks like a fortress of steel and light in the middle of the dark. The history of the pump stations is a history of pressure management. Because the oil moves uphill through the Adigun Pass, it loses momentum. The pump stations are the hearts of the system, using massive turbines to push the crude back up to its cruising speed. The man can still feel the vibration of Station 4 in the ground, a low, rhythmic thumping that travels through the frozen silt for miles. It is a comforting sound, a reminder of the immense energy that is being used to keep the system alive. The oil inside the pipe is a dark, warm river, moving at 5 miles per hour through the frozen desert. The man imagines the oil, viscous, heavy, and ancient, flowing through the silver cylinder at his side. He is the guardian of that flow, the witness to its passage. The drawing of this part of the walk would be incredibly sparse. A long, horizontal line of silver gray for the pipeline, a parallel line of dark gray for the road, and in between the man, a small, dark vertical stroke, illuminated by a single blurred orange circle. The background would be a uniform expanse of deep, saturated indigo, with no stars and no horizon. It is a scene of absolute, boring endurance. The man is not looking for adventure. He is looking for leaks, for frost heave, for the subtle signs of thermal degradation. He is looking for anything that would interrupt the steady, predictable hum of the system. He finds nothing. The engineering is sound. The maintenance is constant. The cold is the only thing that changes, growing deeper and more profound as he moves further north. He passes a material site, a massive gravel pit that was used during the construction of the road. Now, it is a hollowed-out depression in the tundra, filled with shadows and snow. The history of the material sites is a boring history of excavation and gravel grading. Thousands of tons of rock were dug out of these pits, sorted by size, and hauled away to create the bed of the Dalton. The man looks into the pit, his lantern light catching the jagged edges of the frozen earth. It looks like a graveyard of industry, a place where the tools and the energy of the 70s have been buried under the ice. He feels the weight of that history in the silence. The construction era was a time of noise, of diesel engines and shouting men and the constant, violent roar of machinery. Now, it is just a memory, a series of indentations in the permafrost that are slowly being filled by the wind. The wind returns, but it is a ground blizzard wind, a low-level flow that picks up the loose, dry snow and carries it in long, horizontal streamers across the road. The streamers look like the brushstrokes of a white pastel pencil, moving with a fluid, hypnotic grace. They swirl around the man's boots, erasing his tracks as soon as he makes them. He feels like he is walking on water or through a cloud. The sense of movement is lost. Without a fixed horizon or a visible sky, he could be walking in place. He focuses on the pipeline. The pipe is the only thing that is real. It is a solid, unmoving line of steel that connects the north to the south. He runs his mitten along the galvanized jacket. The texture is cold and rough, the metal feeling like frozen skin. He follows the rivets, counting them as he goes. 1, 2, 3, 4. The repetition is his shield against the void. It keeps his mind from drifting into the dangerous, empty spaces of the North Slope. The cold has reached a point of absolute stillness. The mercury in a thermometer would be hovering near 40 degrees below zero, a temperature where the very air seems to lose its elasticity. Every movement the man makes creates a sharp, crackling sound, as if the atmosphere were made of thin glass. He moves his jaw, feeling the ice on his face mask break into 1,000 tiny shards. He doesn't feel the cold anymore. He feels only the lack of heat. He is a closed system, a small, humid pocket of life moving through a vast, heatless vacuum. His mission is to keep moving, to keep the lantern burning, and to keep the history of the pipeline alive in his mind. He is the walker, the silent observer of the silver vein, moving through the blue-gray dark of the Arctic night toward a destination that is always just beyond the next mile marker. The drawing continues. More charcoal for the road, more navy blue for the sky, more white pastel for the ground blizzard. The lantern light is a small, dying spark of orange in a world of receding tones. It is a quiet history. It is a boring history. It is the history of a man and a pipe, alone on the North Slope, waiting for a morning that will not come for another month. The hum of the oil is his only company, a steady, vibrating roar that tells him the world is still alive, somewhere far beyond the ice. He continues his march, one step at a time, through the beautiful, heavy, and absolute silence of the Brooks Range foothills. The final stretch of the North Slope coastal plain is a landscape of absolute, horizontal indifference. Here, the world has been flattened by the weight of the sky, a vast, dark velvet sheet that has been pressed down upon the permafrost until there is no distinction between the earth and the void. The man moves through this void like a slow-moving ink stain on a sheet of deep indigo paper. In a vintage-colored pencil drawing, this scene would be composed of almost entirely dark tones, charcoal, navy, and a bruised, saturated violet, with the texture of the paper providing the only grain to the darkness. The lantern in his hand is now a flickering, dying ember, its amber light struggling against the oppressive density of the freezing air. The light does not reach the ground. It merely illuminates the swirling diamond dust around his knees, creating a ghostly, golden cloud that follows him like a faithful dog. The air is so cold that it has lost its transparency. It feels thick, granular, and heavy, as if the man were walking through a sea of pulverized glass. The history of this final section of the Dalton Highway is a boring history of terminal velocity and coastal erosion. In the summer of 1977, when the first oil finally reached the end of the line, there was no great celebration here. There was only the steady, mechanical clicking of valves and the low, rhythmic roar of the pumps. The oil had traveled 800 miles, crossing 3 mountain ranges and nearly 1,000 rivers, and here, on the edge of the Beaufort Sea, it simply continued its journey into the massive holding tanks. The man walks alongside the pipe, which is now almost entirely white, encased in a thick, crystalline armor of hoarfrost. The history of this frost is a history of moisture migration. Even in the desert-dry air of the Arctic winter, the slight heat of the oil creates a microscopic pressure differential, drawing what little humidity exists toward the steel. The frost grows in long, delicate needles, some of them several inches long, pointing toward the north like a forest of frozen compasses. To touch them is to feel the absolute fragility of the ice. They shatter at the slightest breath, falling to the gravel like diamond dust. The man's body has reached a state of terminal equilibrium with the environment. He no longer feels the cold as a sensation. He feels it as a property of his being. His fingers, inside the multi-layered deerskin and wool mittens, are no longer extremities. They are heavy, unfeeling weights at the ends of his arms. His toes are gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing pressure that matches the rhythm of his heart. He moves with a mechanical gait, the pipeline shuffle, a way of walking that minimizes the expenditure of energy and keeps the center of gravity low. Each step is a deliberate calculation of friction and momentum. The gravel of the road is now a solid, monolithic block of ice and stone, its surface polished to a mirror finish by the wind. In the light of the lantern, the road looks like a drawing made with a silver pencil on a black surface, the highlights sharp and cold. The man focuses on the rivets of the pipeline jacket. They are his milestones. 1 rivet, 2 rivets, 3. There are over 50,000 rivets in this final stretch, and he knows the history of every one. The visual landscape is a study in the long dark. There is no moon, and the stars have been obscured by a high-altitude haze of ice crystals. The aurora has long since faded, leaving behind only the deep, saturated indigo of the atmosphere. The mountains are hundreds of miles behind him, a memory of verticality in a world that is now purely horizontal. The only vertical things are the VSMs, the silver supports that hold the pipe aloft. In the dark, they look like the legs of a giant, sleeping insect, stretching out into the gloom. The man passes an expansion loop, a massive, U-shaped bend in the pipe that allows for the final thermal contraction of the steel. The history of the expansion loop is a history of stress relief. In the 1970s, engineers realized that if the pipe were to be fixed rigidly at both ends, the cold of the north slope would cause it to tear itself apart with a force of several million pounds. The loop is the solution, a simple, elegant piece of geometry that absorbs the movement of the metal. The man walks into the shadow of the loop. The air here is even stiller, even colder. He can hear the oil moving, a deep, resonant glug-glug that sounds like a giant drinking from a stone cup. He thinks about the history of the cold soak. This is the process by which a machine or a structure reaches the temperature of its surroundings. The pipeline has been in a state of cold soak for 40 years. Its steel, its insulation, its concrete foundations, they have all become a part of the Arctic's thermal history. The man, too, is undergoing a cold soak. His parka is no longer a garment. It is a thermal barrier that has reached its limit. The heat of his body is a small, flickering flame in a vast, icy cavern. He knows that if he were to stop walking, the flame would go out. The history of the pipe walker is a history of movement as a form of survival. As long as he moves, he is a living element in the system. If he stops, he becomes a part of the permafrost, a frozen fossil in a suit of Gore-Tex and wool. He continues. Snap, pause, snap, pause. The cadence is a prayer to the god of thermodynamics. The road begins to curve slightly, following the final bend of the Sag River. Here, the wind returns, but it is a dead wind, a slow, heavy flow of air that carries the scent of frozen salt and ancient, buried peat. The wind does not whistle, it sighs, a low-frequency vibration that he can feel in the bridge of his nose. The history of the Sag River Delta is a boring history of siltation. For thousands of years, the river has been depositing the bones of the Brooks Range into the sea, creating a flat, featureless plain of mud and ice. The road and the pipeline sit on top of this silt, held up by the sheer willpower of engineering. The man looks out over the tundra. It is a sea of gray pastel, the drifts of snow looking like frozen waves in a charcoal drawing. There is no life here. No birds, no foxes, no caribou. They have all moved south, or they are huddled in the snow, waiting for a spring that is still months away. The man is the only thing moving in a world that has been frozen into a state of perfect crystalline stasis. He reaches a final block valve, the last gate before the oil enters the terminal complex. The valve is housed in a massive, reinforced concrete vault that is partially buried in the gravel. The history of this valve is a history of finality. If this gate were to close, the entire 800-mile system would come to a grinding, high-pressure halt. It is the master switch of the silver vein. The man stops at the vault. He clears the frost from the inspection window, his mittens making a dry, abrasive sound against the glass. Inside, he can see the massive hydraulic actuator, a heavy piece of machinery painted a dull, industrial yellow. It is covered in a fine layer of oil and frost, looking like a vintage sketch of a submarine engine. The pressure gauges are steady. The needles are fixed points in a circle of white light. Everything is as it should be. The boring history of the pipeline continues without interruption. His lantern gives a final, sputtering flicker and goes out. The man is plunged into absolute darkness. For a moment he stands still, his heart thumping against his ribs. The world is gone. There is no road, no pipe, no sky. There is only the sensation of the wind and the vibration of the oil in the ground. He does not panic. He has walked this path in his mind 1,000 times. He knows the texture of the gravel. He knows the hum of the pipe. He closes his eyes, though it makes no difference. He feels the cold pressing against his eyelids, a heavy, soothing weight. He begins to walk again, guided by the sound. The thrum-thrum of the oil is his compass. It is a deep, resonant sound that fills the world, a mechanical heartbeat that tells him he is still on the path. He is a ghost walking in a graveyard of shadows, a vertical line in a horizontal universe. The drawing of this final moment would be the most minimal of all. A solid sheet of dark, textured paper. No lines, no colors, no highlights. Just the texture of the paper itself, representing the density of the air and the weight of the silence. Somewhere in the center there would be a single, faint smudge of gray, the ghost of a man moving through the dark. It is a quiet history. It is a boring history. It is the history of the end of the shift. The man knows that ahead, just beyond the next mile marker, there is a small, brightly lit shack where his relief is waiting. There will be hot coffee, the smell of diesel, and the sound of human voices. But for now, there is only the walk. There is only the duty. There is only the silver vein moving through the frozen earth. He reaches the final milepost of his patrol. He doesn't need to see it. He can feel the change in the gravel, the way it becomes wider and more packed as it nears the terminal. He stops. He turns back toward the south, toward the mountains he crossed days ago. They are invisible, but he can feel their presence, a heavy, dark memory against the sky. He has walked the spine of the continent. He has witnessed the flow of the earth's blood. He has been the silent observer of a boring, beautiful, and absolute history. The hum of the pipeline continues, a steady, vibrating roar that fills the night, a mechanical lullaby for the frozen north slope. The man takes a final, deep breath, the cold air turning to ice in his throat. He exhales a long, white cloud of vapor, a final signature on the dark page of the Arctic. The shift is over. The routine is preserved. The oil moves on.